welcome to Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Sam Spieler and Eyad Darris.
Hey. Hey.
Hello, hello. Today we are concluding our discussion of Paradise by Abdulrazak Gurnah. This is the last book in our series Rich Country, Poor Country. If you're joining us for the first time, you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at r Canonical Pod. Next week, we will wrap up our series by talking about all three books that we read for this series: The Sympathizer by Viet Nguyen, The Disaster Tourist by Ko-eun, and this book, Paradise by Abdulrazak Gurnah.
So, in the review episode, we kind of talked about this book being a Bildungsroman. James, you had said it was a travel narrative. But what if I were to call this a philosophical novel? Would you agree with that?
I think I could get along with that.
What defines a philosophical novel? Is it a book that has some philosophical ideas in it, or does it have to actively engage with philosophy?
I think it's more than just having the ideas, but not necessarily an active engagement. I think for me, the important part is that the ideas are structural and the novel is built around those ideas. And that's the way I see it in this novel.
To clarify, would we say the same for a novel of ideas?
For me, I would say that the philosophical novel is maybe a subset of that. Like the novel of ideas has lots of ideas, but they're not necessarily creating the structure of the book.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say because I don't come from a philosophy background, but if I were pressed to say whether it is or it isn't, I guess I would say it isn't.
Well, let me use an example I think that might help me to make my case for skeptics like James. There is a moment in the middle of the novel that I think is quite pivotal. I think that the moment happens in the village when Aziz and the trading party are confronted by Chatu. Chatu is the sultan of the village that they have visited, and Chatu takes their wares. And after he takes their wares, he says, "All these goods you brought with you belong to us, because all the goods produced by the land are ours. So we are taking them away from you." Later on, he also says this. He says, "Some pale skinned traders like you previously came. He traded them gold and ivory and leather, but they didn't have enough goods to pay. They said they would go and come back, but since then he has not seen them." Then Chatu says, "This merchant is your brother, so your goods will now pay back your brother's debt." First of all, it seems like he's giving them two different stories. It's possible that they're lies. But does his account of things have anything in common? Like, is there a common theme in the way he justifies taking the goods?
I get what you're trying to get at here, I think, although I'm not 100% sure. But sort of, it feels like we're supposed to feel that Aziz is being wronged and yet also understand that it's very possible and maybe even likely that Chatu is telling the truth in some fashion, at least about the second part, that he and his people have been wronged in the past by traitors like Aziz. The first part is harder for me to square, especially with the second story. Maybe you have a philosophical claim that he's making there, but that seems shakier to me. It doesn't seem quite in line with the second one.
Well, in both instances, he's justifying why he can do it, right?
Yeah, they're both justifications, but
But that's important because he doesn't have to justify why. He could have just taken everything by force, but by justifying, it shows that he thinks what he's doing is just and right.
hmm.
Well, if I put it into another context, I think the similarity might emerge. If I come to San Francisco and I take your house, James, and I say, this house belongs to me because I come from this land. So everything on this land is mine. You would probably object to that. Or if I say, well, I met some Chinese people before, James, and they wronged me. And because you're also Chinese, I can take it out on you. That I think would also not be acceptable to the modern mind. So there is a rationale or a justification that he's offering, which is based on what we might call a more natural ordering of things. I think the way that Chatu conceptualizes justice is based on something immediate. I'm from this land. Whatever is on this land is mine. You're that kind of person. So whatever that kind of person does, you're responsible for. Do you think that these are points of view that we as modern people should respect?
That's a difficult question because it's not the basis of our law. We don't engage in this kind of collective justice or justification like when it comes to civil suits in the West, which is what he's alleging here. This is not how we would settle a civil dispute.
I think it shows a worldview that Chatu has, which is distinct from our own worldview, not only based on the law and the specifics of the way the law of our country works, but also just in general where we are in history, regardless of what country we live in. But then what about Aziz? Because Aziz does live at the same time as Chatu. Does Aziz think in the same way? Does Aziz justify the way he acts in the same way that Chatu justifies the way he acts?
He does justify his actions in certain ways. There's a section on page 131 that actually is one of the sections I was talking about in the review episode that really stuck out to me as being very different from the rest of the book, where he's talking about the Germans coming into Tanzania. And he talks about them in terms of how the Arabs before them also came and did very similar things. A different method, but similar outcomes. I'm not going to read it because it's actually really long. He talks about these different lords that came into East Africa. And I think he does that, even though at first it seems very unclear what he's talking about. And I think he does that to try to show that they're no different from the Germans and that really they're no different from other traders. In that instance, he talks about how he isn't taking slaves, even though that gets revealed to not really be true. But I think he does try to justify his actions, the actions of his predecessors, and the actions of the Germans, or in appealing to Germans.
I think what's distinct about Aziz as compared to Chatu is there is no place in his rhetoric for something being natural. For him, he considers himself right in what he is doing based more on a social fact, on a precedent set by the actions of other people. In his traveling party, he has a overseer, and that overseer is very fearful of the Germans. But, Aziz remarks to him, well, they're here for the same reason you and I are. So he has a much more pragmatic view of society. He would not criticize the German presence there because they're after personal gain in the same way that Aziz is. Likewise, I think that we can see him using the facts of the marketplace and social interaction in the market as a justification for why it was okay for his ancestors to buy slaves. There's this passage where he says, buying slaves from these parts was like picking fruit off of a tree. They didn't even have to capture their victims themselves, although some of them did so for the pleasure of it. there were enough people eager to sell their cousins and neighbors for trinkets. So I think Aziz's worldview is distinct because the society that he finds himself in dictates to him what is just and what is unjust. And I think that that is much more of a contemporary view of justice than the view of justice that we find coming from Chatu.
Does Chatu's capitulation to the Germans also fall in line with that kind of older sense that obviously he has to follow the Germans because the Germans just seem like this stronger power, that they must be obeyed?
I would guess that in that scene, his perception of justice is not altered. He doesn't think that the Germans are right to force him to release Aziz and their goods, but he realizes that they have superior power. But in his heart and in his mind, I would guess that he thinks of them as transgressing the natural laws of the world.
Do you think Chatu is portrayed negatively because he's the antagonist of that story? And by extension, is this portraying natural law as being somehow more barbaric?
I wouldn't say so. I think that with my interpretation of this as a philosophical novel, I don't think that Gurnah wants to cast him in that light. I think he's much more interested in the contest of ideas, and that contest is much more interesting when you don't have one who's clearly bad. I would say, though, that he's distinctly anti modern.
Okay, you might have to explain both of those because, first of all, Chatu does not win this argument. And maybe that's just a plot point. Maybe that has to happen so that they can move on. But not necessarily. What it allows Gurnah to do is bring the Germans in. I think that's more important to the story than if Aziz simply lost everything. I think it's maybe more interesting to the unfolding of history.
Well, I agree with you, but I think Gurna maintains a neutral point of view because by the end of that scene, that conflict, I don't think you feel that Chatu is really a bad guy. Maybe you even feel sorry for him, but I don't think you feel that he is totally in the wrong.
Yeah, when you look at his people seem to really like him. And I get the sense that they know what's coming, not because Chatu makes a habit of this necessarily, although maybe he does, but that I think they believe in their leader, right?
The reason why I'm focusing here, though, on Chatu and Aziz is because I think that the two of them represent some competing ideas about the origins of justice. I think the kind of naive or intuitive view that we might have is that justice is a natural thing. This was put forth by a philosopher, Thomas Reid. He believed that justice was a natural thing, and whatever was just or unjust would be self evident to the mind of a normal person. There was no need to discover the precedence of that sense of justice because it was just something obvious. In the same way that we can feel something warm or cold, we know what is just and is unjust. On the other hand, David Hume made the argument that our idea of what justice is socially constructed. And this, I think, is the more modern view. Hume argues that justice evolved because people are selfish and because we live in a world full of scarce resources. So a concept emerges in our minds that we call justice as a way to help people in society to respect each other's property. I don't think that either Aziz or Chatu have a concern for these ideas about justice specifically, but I do think that their worldviews are part of the same genealogy of ideas, with Chatu representing the organic, the immutable, and the original, and Aziz representing the hybrid, the contingent, and the modern. So there is a way that they are pulled apart from each other. And I don't know if I would place one at the end or not. Because if these two people represent points on a line, where do the Germans sit?
That's a tough question because it seems like they're constructing a society that they think is more just by way of laws and authority, but that authority is not based on anything other than their might. It's a self imposed authority. I don't know where on the line that is.
So, one question that we have to ask ourselves is our evaluation of the Germans based purely on what's in the book, or are we using our historical knowledge of European colonialism to evaluate them? Because purely based on what we see in the book, it's actually not very clear. We don't get a lot of German presence in the novel. We do get examples of harsh justice. We know that they decree by fiat. They would say, for example, if this happens again, we're going to hang X number of people, but we don't get a justification for that. So there isn't much rationale for why Germans act the way they do. I think the reason why this is because they're supposed to be people that the indigenous Africans and the Arabs don't understand. They're purposely made opaque.
I think that's true. I tend to view the role of the Germans in the novel, at least with respect to this interpretation of the novel as a philosophical novel, incorporating all of my knowledge about what German East Africa was like and the entire broader context. In that respect, I would say that their worldview is not the same as that of Aziz, and certainly not the same as Chatu. I think that there is a continuum of how people conceptualize justice, and the Germans are on the far end of that continuum, if only because they establish justice through might, and might then establishes the social context that somebody like Aziz would have used. They create the law first by hanging people, and then they use not the hanging people, but the law that was created by hanging people as the justice that they refer to. And I think somebody like Aziz and other Arabs in the novel, like Muhammad Abdullah, his overseer, they have to blend the natural with the social in ways that the Germans might not. I think another very interesting quote is during the journey inland, Muhammad Abdullah is talking to Yusuf, and he says, "You'll see some of the places we pass where people have not yet been brought into life by trade, and they live like paralyzed insects. There are no people more clever than traders, no calling more noble. It is what gives us life." So I find this quite interesting. It seems to me that he is conflating the social act of trading goods with the biological fact of life. What does that mean?
Pass.
I don't either. I don't either. Can you ask the question again? Just, but I don't know that I will either.
The way I look at it is that the trade that he benefits from is so important to him that he wants to make it important to other people, because if other people are also willing to trade, he only stands to benefit from that. If you are a trader and nobody will trade with you, you lose.
Sure.
But more important than that, I think being involved in trade and being connected to outsiders engages somebody with that social world that people like Aziz thrive in. If you are living on your own and just farming and creating things for yourself, you are more inclined to believe that there is a natural sense of justice rather than a socially determined one, right?
Um, maybe. I don't fully know if I agree. I think you can live on your own and still have a social sense of justice. Take Hussein, who lives on his mountain. He lives by himself. He doesn't do a whole lot of trade, but I have a feeling he has a more social and modern sense of justice than, say, Chatu does. I don't think it's the living on one's own in subsistence that is the factor there.
I think among the non indigenous people, there is also a kind of a continuum because you're right that Hussein has different ideas compared to Aziz, in that Aziz justifies his actions based on the precedent of what others have done before. Hussein, I think, is much more pious in a sincere way. He's very critical, actually, of what Aziz does because he has perhaps a more transcendent view. It's not necessarily a natural view of justice. He kind of answers to God as the supreme authority.
What I think is interesting is how Aziz has a second bride, and that this is okay in his understanding of the world. That it's okay to have a child bride who's paid to you to resolve a debt. But you get the sense from Khalil that the fact that his sister's held captive feels wrong. And Yusuf, maybe he doesn't realize it until the very end of the book, but maybe he also realizes that this is wrong.
I think that's clear as well because in that family situation, Aziz is also very willing to be considered an uncle, but also as Sayyid, the master. So, why is he willing to mix those two identities? By that same token, why is it that Khalil is so clear with Yusuf that Yusuf should not consider him an uncle? It seems to me that there is a special kind of privilege that comes with the familial natural bond that Khalil does not want to give him.
Well, I know that you're reading it from the point of view of justification. Looking at it from a different point of view, Khalil calls him master because that's what he is to Khalil. Khalil can't escape his bonds.
Well, and the whole he is not your uncle thing is through most of the book a joke to Yusuf. Like, even as he gets older, when he thinks it to himself, it still kind of makes him chuckle. It goes from being a harsh reality that he doesn't understand to something that he can turn over in his head and laugh about, to at the very end of the book, finally understanding where Khalil and where Amina fit into that. What I mean is, we don't fully understand until the end how close Khalil is to that differentiation between master and slave. Whereas Yusuf is not close to that differentiation really until the end.
Perhaps he's not close to master and slave, but rather he's a slave, but also in a real way, a brother in law. It seems Aziz is very willing to mix these categories in a way that seems unusual to us now, and I think seems unusual even to Khalil in the context of that world of the novel. How can somebody be so close in such a quote unquote natural way, but still be considered property?
Well, because it benefits Aziz. I think that's the easy answer, is that Aziz is the one that benefits from that blending. No one else benefits. Aziz is the only one that's able to cross those lines.
I think that the title of the novel is very ironic. When the Western mind thinks of Africa before European contact, we do think of it as a paradise. But I think what the novel makes clear to us is that, in fact, the Omani and the Punjabi presence on the continent was problematic as well, perhaps in different ways, but still problematic. I think it's also worth noting that Gurnah himself also had troubles as a result of this colonization because he had to flee the continent in 1967 after the Zanzibar Revolution when Arab descended people like him became unwelcome in his nation. In a very real sense, though, this nation was his home and still is his home in many eyes. So, what I think this brings into conflict is the kind of post colonial idea of the social, or in terms of citizenship, we could call it the jus soli. Is that how you pronounce it? Juice, like orange juice?
Is it like Aoju?
Like the dip?
Yeah.
No. Like it brings the idea of the social world, citizenship by birth in a certain nation, into conflict with the other idea, jus sanguinis, which is the natural idea of citizenship by blood of a certain ethnic group. So, the larger question, I think, in terms of a post colonial attitude towards this novel is, does a colonist, whether European or otherwise, gain any sort of natural rights in a territory after some passage of time?
Who are you asking? I mean, it depends on who you're asking, right? If you're asking the colonist, I think their answer is yes. But if you're asking the colonized or, the modernized person, I think most people would say no.
Well, I think it's appealing here to a sense of justice that we would imagine would apply to both parties. So somebody like Gurnah is descended from colonizers, but he has been living there his whole life until 20 years of age when he had to flee the country. Because he was born there, does he have any sort of rights to that nation? Does he have any sort of natural rights to that country?
Is it time or is it birth? Those are two different things. I also think interacting with the people in a way that, is, I don't want to say beneficial to both parties, but maybe interacting with others on their own terms is maybe what grants you those rights. But you mentioned birth and time, and those I feel like are two different things.
Well, what about ethnicity? Because the ethnicity of the people indigenous to that region are not his ethnic group, but is it fair to grant access to a certain territory based on some fixed point in history? Because the Arab peoples of which Gurna is a part had lived in that area for 200 years. Does that not matter?
Yeah, I'm far less sympathetic to this idea that blood is tied to land and that a certain ethnicity holds claim to a certain piece of land. I mentioned this in a previous episode how, we tend to view history from this simplistic point of view of the colonizers and the colonized, but we overlook the fact that those who have been colonized might themselves have been colonizers. And the world just keeps on going in that fashion because migration is a fact of life. Let's say we take the perspective of people who lived in a place in the 1800s and we say they're the natural landowners of a place. Okay, I mean, but why not the people from the 1600s or the 1400s? It's complicated because the people who have been displaced may have been historically oppressed or massacred, and in many instances, they're still disadvantaged in modern society. This isn't to absolve the colonizer of the violence that they perpetrated or to paper over the inequity of modern life caused by history. But despite that, I just don't find the argument very convincing that just because someone has a certain genetic marker that they should be given special rights to land. And I would apply that to all ethnicities because, once again, I think migration is just a fact of human society. And we are too often tied to a certain worldview of a certain time period.
James the gentrifier coming in hot.
Yeah. I mean, so where are we going to stop, right? Like, why would, for example, the Pomo Indians have home claim to a certain part of California? Why not the people they displaced? And once again, it's not that I think that those people were not wronged because I think certainly, you know, they were disadvantaged, taken advantage of. But it's just that don't think they hold any special rights to land because then we would be taking a very narrow view of history.
I think I agree with you, but I think the ugly conclusion that follows from that way of thinking is that if displacement is natural and unavoidable, you end up with biggest army problem solving. Whoever has the most weapons ends up being in the right. And that I think is also unsettling to a lot of people.
There's also a distinction that you can make between colonizer and migrator, right? Those get conflated often, and they don't have the same intentions.
Also, one's a real word and one's not.
Okay. Well, you know what I mean. A person who migrates to a place versus a person who colonizes another place. They have different intentions.
In the novel, I think we see an example of this through intermarriage. For example, when Yusuf is in Chatu's village, and there is a lot of fuss made over him and his relationship with the girl in the village, and the fact that if they were married, that would form some sort of alliance between his group and their group. So, in the broader sense of colonial politics, is there a way for a colonial presence to quote unquote buy legitimacy in occupied territory?
I think there are a number of ways to buy legitimacy, but it's unpleasant to think about because it inevitably leads to displacement or suffering.
I'm thinking here of certain countries that move into areas. These areas are perhaps much poorer than others, and they do a lot of infrastructure projects. They build dams and roads and railways, and they say, well, you should be very happy that we're here because look at all of these things that we've done for you. That's the rhetoric, that's the talking point for why they should be there. And that to me, I think, is a very macro lens view. But I think even on the micro lens, the example of intermarriage, I think, is also very appropriate.
Yeah, intermarriage is an age old custom. That's how diplomatic issues were settled. So, yeah, that's definitely one way of legitimizing one's right to rule or right to inhabit. It's an interesting topic, but is it connected to the previous topic?
I think it is because it's still connected to the idea of justice. Who has a right to a territory? If you said, as a Chinese person growing up in San Francisco, that you had the right to reside in China indefinitely, I think there is a case to be made that you're a colonizer. But then there's also a very obvious case to be made that you have a right to this area as well, right? And this is offered to Jewish people. They have birthright tours of Israel, even if they've never had any connection to that land. By being Jewish, there are people who say, well, you should be allowed to come here and we'll actually pay for you to take a trip here.
Yeah, I think if you're Italian, you need what, like 1/16th Italian blood to get Italian citizenship.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same for Greek as well.
But all of this is just kind of based off of the past. These things don't really agree with any modern idea of justice. I think that's why I bring it up, is that this is the part of justice that's kind of a blind spot to us. We don't want to talk about it.
I think part of it is this is the way our minds are wired. We have a hard time thinking of the world as being constantly in flux, and it is incredibly problematic for a person if one's sense of identity is what's in flux. It's much easier if one thinks I'm American and American is X, or that person is not American because that person is not Y. It's much more complicated when you start problematizing everything, right? And saying, well, we don't know what's American because what's American is based on this law or that law. It's our natural need to make things simple. And this is our own identity, and identity is important to us. All right. Well, we'll have to stop here. If you thought one of us was way off on one of our takes, you can let us know on social media at Canonical Pod, We are also on Reddit at our canonical pod. Next week, we will talk about all 3 books that we read in our series. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.